going to talk a bit about reading poetry, some of the things that we need to look for, some of the ways we need to handle it, because it is something that's a little bit different from what we're used to reading when we are reading prose. And often students react to poetry kind of badly, to be honest, because it's so different from what we're used to reading. Prose is easy to read in many ways because it seems like it's the way we talk, or it seems like something we're used to reading, particularly for novel readers, or we like to read a lot of articles about sports or about celebrities or whatever, right? So everything that we read in a newspaper is in prose, so we're used to that, or in a magazine. Poetry is something different. And so there are some ways to approach it that are a little bit different. There are some things to pay attention to that are a little bit different. The first of those things, we want to think about how reading works differently here, because poems are often constrained by their rhythm, constrained sometimes by a rhyme scheme, right? And so poets have to use language very economically, and they have to really concentrate and really narrowly focus the language. And this is a bit different from other types of literature. There is an attention to literary language in all literature, but poetry especially is focused on that language in a particular way. So when we're reading, and I'm going to do this with my Last Duchess to talk about that a little bit, we want to pay attention not to stopping at the end of every line, but instead stopping at every, what we would call an end stop. So a period, that's the obvious one, right? That's the end of a sentence normally, a semicolon or a colon. Now, even when you stop at a semicolon or a colon, that's kind of the end of the thought, but it's not the end of the sentence. Basically, the point is the end of a sentence is not the same thing as the end of a line. Often we need to keep reading through. So if a line ends with a comma, that means we still have more sentence to go. There's still more thought to go. And so we have to slow down and pay attention to what we're reading. When you have that, when you have the carryover of a thought, the carryover of a sentence, that's something called enjambment. So for example, in My Last Duchess, if we look at this, then we can see that the first line ends with a comma, and that the period doesn't come until the middle, almost the end of the second line, but the second line then ends with nothing, right? It's just a word. There's no punctuation whatsoever. So we have to keep carrying over. So we have this enjambment over each line. Now, the rhymes work at the end of each line, right? This is in couplets, right? And that's 2 lines of rhymed verse, right? 2 things rhyming. But the thoughts keep going. So when we read it, we want to pay attention carefully to that. So for example, right, this begins with, "That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, comma." So we're not done looking as if she were alive, right? So we don't actually have a fragment there. What we have is one sentence that carries over 2 lines. So if we read it carefully, right, and we can pause at the end of a line, but we don't want to fully stop at the end of the line, we can read it something like this. "That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking at as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands." All right, so I've had 2 sentences, right, 3 end stops. One of them's a colon, which tells us something is following from that. But that's how we want to read, right? So we want to keep going. And sometimes it helps to really just sort of try to think about these the way we would read prose. Of course, there are all these sort of functions of form, right? That there is this rhyming, there is this rhythm to it. But we really want to concentrate when we're trying to figure out what the basic theme, the basic idea of a poem is. We want to begin there, right? Read all the way through to the end stop. As we read a poem, we really want to think about basically the situation of a poem, really the story of the poem. In many cases, we will have a story. Not in every case. Obviously, with the poems of William Blake, The Tiger, for example, doesn't exactly have a story. It has an animal, it's describing an animal, it's meditating on the idea of an animal. Well, not all lyric poetry will have a story, but a great deal actually will, and we may have to infer that story. Now, this one clearly has a story. This poem, My Last Duchess, is what's called a dramatic monologue, and this was a style of poetry that Robert Browning wrote quite a bit of. And I like to think about it, and I like looking at it because it gives us a very obvious situation or an obvious instance that the persona, right, so that's the person speaking the poem, is not the same as the poet. The persona is the speaker of the poem. The poet is a completely separate entity. In this case, right, that we have My Last Duchess, which is written in 1842, right, or published in 1842. When we get into it, we realize, oh, Robert Browning is not this Duke of Ferrar, which is who the speaker is in this poem. He's not this persona. He better not be this persona, because then he's murdered his wife. And we know that's not the case, right? He's not this Italian Duke who killed his wife. We know that he is, in fact, an English poet who was very happy with his wife. So when we look at this poem, right, we can think about what's being done here. And in this poem, we have a duke who is talking about his last duchess, as in the previous one. And what we begin to realize in this, right, that he's showing off all this art that he has in this house. And I'll come back to his reaction to his former wife, the wife who is no longer living. The way we know that he's sort of showing this off to another person, he says, "That's my last duchess, painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive," right? So he's pointing to something on the wall. He's pointing to a painting and saying, hey, that's my last wife, my last duchess. Looking as if she were alive suggests, right, that implies I'm looking for a new wife because she's dead. But we know that he's showing off art because towards the end of the poem, look with me at line around 49. Okay, so flip the page and find line 49, which you can find by looking at those little numbers along the side, that those are just the line numbers. He says, the count, even a little bit before, he says, "I repeat, the count your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretense of mine for dowry will be disallowed." I am talking to a representative of some count because his daughter's looking to get married, or he's looking to marry off his daughter. So we know that that's the situation, right? So we know that here is the Duke of Ferrar looking to, or who's entertaining a visitor who wants to know about, will you marry this count's daughter? And he says, "No, his fair daughter self, as I avowed at starting, is my object." Right? Oh, I want to marry her. Right? "Nay, we'll go together down, sir." And he's saying, right, so we have these pauses in here. "Nay, we'll go together down, sir." So really we can sort of imagine that there is a conversation going on. And that's what happens in a lot of these poems by Browning. And then we get the last three lines. "Notice Neptune, though taming a seahorse, thought a rarity which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me." And so there's this suggestion then that here's a bronze sculpture of Neptune taming a giant seahorse, right, a giant horse. So all these images of this classical figure. He's showing off art. So we know that that's sort of the larger context for this poem. But we really don't want to let this count's daughter marry the Duke, because we discover in all that he says about his last duchess, right, in Frau Pandolf's design, that he really did not like her. In fact, that he was very jealous of anything and everything that she did, right? So, for example, if we look at around let's say about line 13, he says, "Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek." It wasn't just me who caused that little nice rosy cheek that you see in the painting to show up. Perhaps Frau Pandolf chanced to say her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. Right? So the painter spoke to her, and she appreciated it. Right? So he's suggesting that he did not like that. She had a heart. How shall I say? We get these narrative interruptions over and over again. She had a heart. How shall I say? Too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She was impressed by everyone, and not enough by me, says the Duke, essentially. Right? That everything that I gave her, right? She thanked men, good, but thanked somehow I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of 900 years' name with anybody's gift. Right? So we have this Duke who is incredibly proud of his lineage, of his heritage, of his family name. And he sees this Duchess. Now, most of us would say, this is a good person. She's kind, she's generous. She's like, she is ungrateful, that she cannot understand all that I give to her. And then she's thanking this guy who brought her some cherries. The same as she's thanking me for giving her this name. And so we have this incredibly jealous, angry Duke. And there is this insinuation, both from this and from sort of the historical record, that this Duchess did not die naturally, right? And so we probably should not be letting the next Duchess be this Count's daughter. So as we read, right, and this is in our innocence and experience section, we want to think about sort of not just innocence to experience from childhood to adulthood, but sort of how does the innocence of the viewer or the innocence and inexperience of the person being addressed, how do we discover the experience of this particularly vile nobleman, and how can we think about those things and think about that in contrast to other things. Of course, you've got some really good questions in there. You can compare it to some of the other poems. But finally, I want to return to this note. When we are reading poetry, remember, always remember, we are talking about a persona. We're talking about a person other than the poet who's doing the speaking, right? This poem makes that abundantly clear, that we have to be careful when we do that. So we don't want to say that Browning says this. We want to say that the Duke says this. We don't know what Browning thought, right? And the Browning is not here to explain it to us. All we have is this poem.